Hey, what on earth are you doing with that baby?
What they were about to tell the richest woman in the state. There is nothing else we can do. Billionaire CEO Victoria Langford stood frozen outside the ICU. Her 10-year-old son, Ethan, had been unconscious for 12 days. The country's best neurologists, the most expensive specialists, experimental treatments flown in from Europe. Nothing had worked. One by one, every doctor quietly walked away. Then, an old black homeless man pushed a rusty shopping cart toward the hospital entrance. His gray coat was torn. His boots were held together with duct tape. Security immediately blocked his path. "Move along. This isn't a shelter." The old man didn't argue. He simply looked through the ICU window at the unconscious little boy. His tired eyes suddenly widened, almost as if he recognized something nobody else had noticed. He whispered only 6 words. "You're treating the wrong injury." The head surgeon laughed. Several nurses shook their heads. Security reached for the old man's arm. But before they could drag him away, the unconscious billionaire's son suddenly moved one finger. For the first time, in 12 days, every monitor inside the ICU changed. Every doctor turned around. And the old homeless man quietly said, "If you want him to live, you have exactly 20 minutes. The first sound anyone heard wasn't the monitors. It was laughter. Cold, disbelieving laughter. Dr. Richard Coleman, one of the nation's most respected pediatric neurologists, slowly removed his glasses and stared at the old homeless man as if he had just heard the world's worst joke. "You expect us to believe you know something that 6 medical teams don't?" The old man didn't answer. He simply kept looking through the glass. His eyes never left Ethan. Security guard Marcus stepped closer. "Sir, you need to leave." The old man nodded politely. "I will. But if that boy dies, it won't be because medicine failed. It'll be because nobody listened." Those words irritated Dr. Coleman. He folded his arms. "And who exactly are you?" The old man smiled faintly. "Nobody. A homeless man. That's all people see." Victoria Langford had barely spoken all morning. For 12 days she had lived inside this hospital. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten properly. Every hour another specialist had arrived with hope, only to leave with another apology. She looked at the old man. There was nothing impressive about him. Gray beard, weathered skin, hands rough enough to belong to someone who had spent decades doing hard labor. Certainly not a doctor. Certainly not someone who belonged inside one of the country's most prestigious hospitals. Still, something about the way he looked at Ethan felt different. Not emotional, not desperate, focused, like someone trying to solve a problem. Victoria stepped forward. "What did you mean? When you said we're treating the wrong injury?" The hallway became completely silent. The old man looked at her. "I'll answer. But first, when did the seizures begin?" Victoria frowned. 3 weeks ago. Were they after the accident?" "Yes." The old man slowly nodded. "What kind of accident?" Dr. Coleman interrupted immediately. "That's confidential." The homeless man didn't even look at him. "It matters." Victoria answered anyway. Ethan fell from his horse. He hit the side of his head. The old man quietly closed his eyes. "No." Victoria blinked. "What?" "He didn't." Dr. Coleman sighed loudly. "Enough. The MRI confirms head trauma. The scans confirm swelling. The blood work confirms neurological damage." The homeless man finally looked toward the doctor. "No. The scans confirm what you're looking at. They don't confirm what caused it." Several younger doctors exchanged confused looks. One resident whispered, "What does that even mean?" The old man slowly walked toward the hospital window. Outside, rain quietly covered the parking lot. He pointed toward Ethan's left hand. "Why is only that hand moving?" Nobody answered. He pointed again. "Why has his heartbeat remained perfectly stable during every seizure?" Silence. "And why? Has his oxygen never dropped?" Dr. Coleman hesitated, only for a second, then answered, "Those findings aren't unusual." The homeless man looked disappointed. "They're extremely unusual." Victoria noticed something strange. For the first time, the senior doctors weren't interrupting him. They were thinking. The old man continued, "Did anyone examine his neck?" Dr. Coleman answered confidently, "Of course. Standard procedure." The homeless man asked another question. "Did anyone perform a vascular flow study while the seizures were happening?" Silence. One young neurologist quietly looked toward another. Neither answered. The old man nodded. "I thought so." Victoria stepped closer. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, if the blood supply is being interrupted only during certain movements, you'll never find it on a routine scan." The hallway became still. Dr. Coleman frowned. "That's extremely rare." The old man calmly replied, "So is surviving 12 days. No one spoke. Even the security guards had stopped trying to remove him. Victoria's voice trembled. "Can you help my son?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Ethan again, long enough that everyone in the hallway followed his gaze. Finally he spoke. "I don't know, but I know where I'd start." Dr. Coleman shook his head. "This is absurd. You have no credentials, no identification, no medical license." The old man smiled sadly. "You're right. I don't have any of those anymore." Victoria caught one word. "Anymore." She stared at him. "You said anymore. What were you before?" The hallway fell completely silent again. The old man looked down at his worn boots. For a long moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to answer. Then he quietly said, "Once, I helped build one of the world's leading pediatric neuroscience programs." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then, Dr. Coleman laughed harder than before. Several doctors joined him. One nurse covered her mouth. Another whispered, "He's delusional." The old man didn't defend himself. He had heard those whispers before, thousands of times. Victoria looked at him carefully. His eyes weren't asking to be believed. They weren't begging. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They simply carried the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent years telling the truth and watching people laugh anyway. Before anyone could speak again, a young ICU nurse suddenly burst through the doors. "Doctor!" Everyone turned. She was out of breath. The patient's condition just changed. Every doctor rushed toward the room. Victoria ran behind them. Ethan's heartbeat had suddenly become dangerously irregular. The monitors screamed. One after another, doctors shouted orders. "Norepinephrine. Increase oxygen. Prepare for another seizure." The old homeless man didn't move. He simply stood outside the room, watching. Then, he whispered something so quietly that only the young nurse standing beside him could hear. "It's beginning exactly where I expected." The nurse looked at him in shock. "How? Did you know?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the torn pocket of his old coat. Slowly, he pulled out a faded leather wallet. Inside it wasn't money. It wasn't food stamps. It wasn't identification. It was an old hospital photo. The edges were cracked with age. The picture showed a much younger version of the same man, standing beside a team of surgeons, all of them smiling proudly in front of the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a brand-new pediatric neuroscience center. And in the center of the photograph, standing shoulder to shoulder with the old homeless man, was a much younger Dr. Richard Coleman. The hallway froze. Dr. Richard Coleman stared at the faded photograph as if he had seen a ghost. His confident expression disappeared. His hands trembled ever so slightly. One of the younger doctors looked from the picture to the old homeless man, then back again. "Dr. Coleman, is that really you?" No one answered. The old man slowly handed the photograph to the young nurse. "It was taken 28 years ago, the day we opened the Langston Pediatric Neuroscience Center." The nurse examined the picture carefully. The hospital logo matched. The date matched. Every face looked authentic. Only one question remained. If that's you, who are you? The old man finally looked up. My name is Dr. Elijah Brooks. The name echoed through the hallway. Most of the younger staff looked confused. But every doctor over the age of 50 suddenly went silent. One elderly anesthesiologist whispered under his breath, "It can't be." Another physician slowly removed his mask. "I thought he died years ago." Victoria noticed the change immediately. "What aren't you telling me?" No one answered. Finally, an elderly cardiologist stepped forward. His voice shook. 25 years ago, Dr. Elijah Brooks was considered one of the greatest pediatric neurovascular surgeons in America. He solved cases no one else could explain. He trained hundreds of specialists. He even taught Dr. Coleman. Every pair of eyes turned toward Coleman. The famous surgeon avoided eye contact. Victoria looked back at Elijah. "If all of that is true, why are you living on the streets?" Elijah smiled. "A long story, and not one your son has time to hear." The ICU alarm interrupted them again. This time, the monitor showed Ethan's heart rhythm dropping dangerously fast. Doctors rushed inside. The crash cart rolled across the floor. Coleman immediately took command. "Push another dose. Increase ventilation. Move." Everyone obeyed. But nothing changed. The heartbeat continued falling. Elijah remained outside the glass, watching every movement, watching every monitor, watching every tiny change in Ethan's face. Then he quietly said, "You're treating the numbers, not the boy." Coleman spun around angrily. "Enough. You've made your point. But this is my patient." Elijah nodded calmly. "No. He's your diagnosis, not your patient." Those words hit harder than anyone expected. Victoria stepped between them. "Stop." Both men became quiet. She looked directly at Coleman. "I need one honest answer. If we continue exactly as we are, will my son survive?" The famous surgeon couldn't answer. Not immediately. His silence became the answer. Finally, he lowered his head. "I don't know." Victoria slowly turned toward Elijah. "And if we listen to you?" Elijah answered just as honestly. "I don't know that either. But I know something everyone else has missed." The hallway remained silent. Coleman folded his arms. "What exactly?" Elijah walked to the scan displayed on the digital screen. He didn't touch it. He simply studied it. "Everyone keeps looking here." He pointed toward the brain. "But no one is looking here." His finger moved lower, to the upper cervical spine. Several residents leaned closer. Elijah continued, "The brain isn't always the source. Sometimes, it's the victim." The residents exchanged confused glances. Coleman immediately objected. "The cervical MRI was clean." Elijah nodded. "At rest." Coleman frowned. "What difference does that make?" Elijah looked directly into his eyes. "A bridge can look perfect until a truck drives across it." Silence. The analogy landed. One young radiologist suddenly stepped forward. "Wait. If compression only happens during certain head positions, it wouldn't appear on a standard scan." Elijah smiled for the first time. "Exactly." Coleman immediately shook his head. "That's speculation." "No, it's physiology," Elijah calmly replied. Victoria watched both men carefully. One defended years of established procedures. The other questioned every assumption. Then Elijah asked another question. "When Ethan has a seizure, does anyone notice his head turning slightly to the left first?" The ICU nurse's eyes widened. She looked at another nurse. "You've seen that too?" The second nurse nodded slowly. "I thought it was random." Elijah shook his head. "It isn't." Victoria grabbed the nurse's arm. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "We didn't think it mattered." Elijah quietly answered. "It matters more than anything." The hallway became tense. Coleman looked increasingly frustrated. "This still doesn't prove anything." Elijah nodded. "You're right. It doesn't. But proving it takes less than 5 minutes." Coleman hesitated. What are you suggesting? A dynamic vascular scan. During controlled head movement, one of the radiologists immediately looked surprised. We don't perform those routinely. You should, Elijah answered. They save lives. Coleman sighed deeply. It's risky. Elijah didn't argue. So is watching him die. Victoria took one step forward. I'll authorize it. Coleman looked shocked. Mrs. Langford, there are protocols. There are legal risks. There are. Victoria interrupted. My son has been dying for 12 days. I'm finished waiting. The room fell silent. Coleman slowly looked toward the hospital administrator, who had just arrived after hearing the commotion. The administrator glanced at Victoria, then at Coleman, then at Elijah. Finally he spoke. If the family accepts the risk, we can proceed. Coleman's jaw tightened. He hated losing control, but he had no choice. Fine. Prepare radiology. Within minutes, the ICU transformed into organized chaos. Machines rolled through the corridors. Portable monitors followed Ethan's bed. Nurses carefully stabilized every line. Victoria walked beside her son, never letting go of his hand. As the team reached the imaging suite, Elijah quietly remained behind. The young nurse looked at him. Aren't you coming? Elijah smiled sadly. No, they won't let me. Sure enough, 2 security officers stepped in front of him. I'm sorry, sir. Authorized personnel only. Elijah nodded politely. I understand. He sat alone in the waiting area, back straight, hands folded, completely calm, as if he already knew what the scan would reveal. Inside the imaging room, the dynamic scan began. Everything appeared normal. Coleman looked relieved. I told you. Then, the technician slowly rotated Ethan's head just a few degrees to the left. Suddenly, every monitor changed. Blood flow numbers crashed. The brain's oxygen supply dropped sharply. The room erupted. Oh my God! Run it again. The technician repeated the movement. Again, the blood flow disappeared, then returned the moment Ethan's head was straightened. No one spoke. The impossible had just become undeniable. The radiologist stared at the screen in disbelief. There really is intermittent compression. Coleman couldn't take his eyes off the images. 28 years of experience, destroyed by one 5-minute test. Victoria's legs nearly gave way. So, my son, the radiologist swallowed hard. He was never dying because his brain couldn't heal. He was dying because his brain wasn't getting blood every time the compression occurred. Victoria covered her mouth. Tears rolled down her face. Outside the imaging room, the young nurse ran toward the waiting area. She stopped in front of Elijah. Her eyes were filled with disbelief. You were right. Elijah didn't smile. He simply closed his eyes for one brief moment, then quietly asked the question that made the nurse's heart sink. I know, but tell me, did anyone notice the second problem? The young nurse stared at Elijah. Second problem? Elijah slowly stood up. His old knees cracked as he straightened his back. His eyes remained fixed on the imaging room. The compression isn't what worries me anymore. The nurse looked confused. Then what does? Elijah took a slow breath. The reason it happened. Inside the imaging suite, no one was celebrating. The scan had answered one question, but created another. Dr. Coleman enlarged the images on the screen. The room fell silent. The blood vessel wasn't blocked by swelling. It wasn't blocked by a blood clot. Something else, something solid, was pressing against it. The radiologist whispered, It looks like a bone fragment. Another doctor shook his head. No, the angle doesn't match. Victoria stepped closer. Will someone please tell me what's happening? Coleman turned toward her. We found the compression, but we still don't know what's causing it. Without knowing that, we can't operate safely. Victoria felt hope slipping away again. So we're back where we started? No one answered, because they were outside. The nurse hurried back to Elijah. They found the compression, but they can't identify what's pressing on the artery. Elijah closed his eyes, exactly as he had expected. He quietly asked, "How old is the CT scanner they're using?" The nurse blinked. I don't know. 7 years. Elijah nodded. That's the problem. She frowned. What do you mean? The image resolution isn't high enough. She looked stunned. You can tell that without seeing the scan? Elijah smiled. I've made that mistake before. The nurse hesitated only a second. Then she made a decision that could cost her career. She pulled out her hospital ID. Come with me. Inside the imaging room, the doors opened. Every doctor looked up. Coleman's face darkened immediately. What is he doing here? The nurse swallowed nervously. I brought him. Coleman's voice became cold. I didn't authorize that. Before anyone could argue, Victoria spoke. I did. Coleman looked at her. You weren't here. I am now. She walked directly toward Elijah. If you see something, tell us. Elijah didn't waste a second. He walked to the monitor. The room watched in complete silence. His eyes scanned every image. Left, right, top, bottom. He never touched the keyboard, only observed. Nearly 2 full minutes passed. Then, he quietly pointed. There. The room leaned forward. Coleman frowned. That's just an imaging artifact. Elijah shook his head. No. It moves. The radiologist zoomed in. Everyone watched carefully. Frame by frame, the tiny shadow shifted. Only slightly, but enough. The radiologist's eyes widened. That's not an artifact. Coleman's heartbeat quickened. What is it? Elijah answered softly. A fractured transverse process. The room fell silent. One orthopedic surgeon stepped closer. No. That fracture would have been obvious. Elijah looked at him. Only if it stayed in place. He pointed again. When Ethan turns his head, the fragment rotates. It pinches the vertebral artery. It cuts blood flow. And seconds later, the seizures begin. Nobody spoke, not even Coleman, because every symptom, every unexplained seizure, every failed treatment suddenly made perfect sense. Victoria felt tears running down her face. Can you fix it? Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Coleman. This isn't my hospital. Coleman remained silent. For the first time in decades, he didn't have the answer. The hospital administrator stepped forward. Can it be repaired? Elijah nodded slowly. Yes. Hope returned to every face. Then Elijah finished his sentence. But only if it's done today. The room froze again. Why today? Victoria asked. Elijah looked toward Ethan. Because every seizure causes more damage. The next one may be the last. The operating room was prepared immediately. Phones rang across the hospital. The best surgical staff assembled within minutes. Yet one question remained. Who would perform the surgery? Coleman looked around the room. This procedure is beyond anyone here. One neurosurgeon quietly admitted. I've only read about cases like this. Another shook his head. I've never operated this close to the vertebral artery. Silence. Everyone slowly turned toward Elijah. Victoria stepped closer. Will you do it? Elijah looked down at his worn hands. His fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear. From age. I haven't held a scalpel in 22 years. Victoria whispered. But can you still save him? Elijah slowly opened and closed his fingers. Memories flooded back. Operating rooms. Bright lights. Children waking up. Parents crying with relief. Then, another memory. The day everything ended. The day he walked away forever. He looked at Victoria. I don't know if I still have steady hands. Coleman suddenly spoke. They're steadier than mine. The room turned toward him. Coleman lowered his head. I should have recognized the signs. I trained under you. I taught those signs to others. And somehow, I stopped seeing patients. I started seeing reports. Elijah remained silent. Coleman took another step. Then something happened, something no one expected. America's most famous pediatric neurosurgeon held out a surgical glove toward the homeless man. "I can't save him, but you can." The room watched in complete silence. Coleman's voice cracked. "Please, teach me one more time." Elijah stared at the glove. For a long moment, he didn't move. The nurses waited. The surgeons waited. Even Victoria stopped breathing. Finally, Elijah accepted the glove. Slowly, quietly, without pride, without anger, without revenge. He looked at Coleman and said, "We save the boy first. We can talk about the past later." Coleman nodded. "Agreed." The operating room doors opened. The surgical lights came alive. Nurses began scrubbing in. Anesthesiologists prepared Ethan. Victoria kissed her son's forehead. "I'll be right here. I promise." As Ethan's bed rolled toward the operating room, Elijah walked beside it. His calm eyes never left the little boy. Just before the doors closed, a young resident rushed down the hallway holding a tablet. "Wait!" Everyone stopped. The resident's face had turned pale. "We've just received Ethan's complete accident report from the ranch." Victoria frowned. "What about it?" The resident looked at Elijah, then at Coleman. His voice shook. "The report says Ethan never fell from the horse." The entire hallway went silent. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "What?" The resident swallowed hard. "The horse never threw him. He was found, already unconscious, before anyone saw the accident." And in that instant, Elijah realized something terrifying. Ethan's injury had never been an accident at all. The hallway fell into absolute silence. No one spoke. No one even moved. Victoria Langford slowly looked at the young resident. "What did you just say?" The resident swallowed hard. The ranch manager finally sent the complete security footage. The stable cameras were offline during the first investigation. They've just recovered the backup files. Victoria's voice trembled. "My son didn't fall?" The resident slowly shook his head. "No." The words hit harder than anything she had heard in the past 12 days. Every doctor looked at one another. If Ethan hadn't fallen, then everything they believed about his injuries was wrong. Elijah stood perfectly still. His expression didn't change. Instead, he quietly asked, "Who was the first person to reach Ethan?" The resident checked the report. "The riding instructor." "And after him?" "The ranch manager." Elijah nodded. "And who called the ambulance?" "The ranch manager." Elijah looked toward Victoria. "Did the police interview everyone?" Victoria frowned. "They said it was an obvious riding accident." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Nothing is obvious, especially when everyone agrees too quickly." Inside the operating room, the anesthesiologist looked toward Elijah. "We're ready." Elijah slowly put on his surgical gloves. For the first time in 22 years, his hands entered an operating room. Every nurse watched him. Some had heard stories about Dr. Elijah Brooks. Others thought those stories were exaggerated. Within seconds, they realized they weren't. His movements were calm, precise, almost effortless. He didn't rush. He didn't waste motion. He simply looked at Ethan, then quietly spoke. "Scalpel." The instrument was already in his hand before anyone realized they had moved. Even Dr. Coleman couldn't hide his amazement. "It hasn't left you." Elijah smiled gently. "It never does." The surgery began. Inside the operating room, silence replaced panic. Only the steady rhythm of monitors filled the air. Every movement mattered. Every millimeter mattered. The tiny bone fragment rested less than 2 millimeters from Ethan's vertebral artery. One mistake would end everything. The assistant whispered, "Blood pressure stable." Elijah nodded. "Suction." A nurse handed it over before he finished speaking. Coleman watched every move, not as the lead surgeon, but as a student, exactly as he had 28 years earlier. Outside, Victoria couldn't sit down. She paced endlessly. Her expensive heels echoed across the empty hallway. The billionaire who controlled thousands of employees could do nothing for the one person who mattered most. She looked toward the operating room door. For the first time in years, money had become meaningless. 3 hours passed, then 4. Inside, the surgery reached its most dangerous moment. Elijah finally located the fractured bone. It was exactly where he expected. But the fragment wasn't loose. It was trapped beneath scar tissue. Removing it carelessly would tear the artery. Coleman quietly asked, "What now?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for 2 seconds, remembering. Then he whispered, "Microscope." The surgical microscope lowered into position. Magnified nearly 20 times, the hidden problem finally appeared. The room gasped. The fragment wasn't pressing on the artery alone. A tiny piece of twisted metal, barely visible, was trapped beside it. Coleman froze. "What is that?" Elijah stared silently, then answered, "Not from a horse." The operating room became silent. The anesthesiologist looked confused. Victoria's son hadn't suffered a riding accident. Someone had struck him with something sharp enough to leave a metal fragment buried deep inside his neck. Outside the operating room, a police detective arrived carrying the recovered ranch footage. Victoria immediately stood. "Tell me." The detective hesitated. "We're still reviewing everything." "I don't care. Tell me." He sighed. The video shows Ethan walking into the stable. 5 minutes later, the cameras lose power. When they come back, the riding instructor is carrying Ethan outside. Victoria stared. "Where's the horse?" There wasn't one. Her knees almost gave way. "So, my son was attacked?" The detective answered honestly. "We believe so." Inside surgery, Elijah carefully removed the tiny metal fragment. The nurse placed it into an evidence container. Coleman stared at it. "It looks like a custom steel pin." Elijah nodded. "Definitely not something found on a saddle." The artery slowly expanded. Blood flow returned. Every monitor immediately changed. Brain oxygen climbed. Heart rhythm stabilized. One by one, the alarms stopped. The room remained silent. No one wanted to speak too soon. Then, the EG monitor displayed something it hadn't shown in nearly 2 weeks. Normal brain activity. The anesthesiologist smiled. "The seizures. They're gone." Several nurses quietly wiped away tears. Coleman looked at Elijah. "You did it." Elijah shook his head. "We did it." 6 hours after entering surgery, the operating room doors finally opened. Victoria jumped to her feet. She couldn't even breathe. Elijah slowly removed his surgical cap. His face looked exhausted. Victoria searched his eyes. He smiled. Just once. "Your son is alive." Victoria broke down. She hugged the old homeless man without saying a word. She didn't see torn clothes anymore. She didn't smell the streets. She only saw the man who had returned her child. The hallway erupted into applause. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, even the security guards who had tried to throw Elijah out, stood and clapped. Marcus, the same guard who had blocked the entrance, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I judged you." Elijah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. So did everyone else. 2 days later, Ethan opened his eyes. The first face he saw wasn't his mother's. It was Elijah's. The little boy smiled weakly. "You're the man who talked to me." Victoria looked confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan whispered. "When I couldn't wake up, I kept hearing someone. He kept saying, 'Don't give up, little man.' He told me, 'Your mom's still waiting.'" Victoria covered her mouth. She had never told anyone those words. Only Elijah smiled. "I figured he could hear us." 1 week later, the investigation was complete. The ranch manager confessed. He had accepted a large bribe from a business rival who wanted to pressure Victoria into selling her company. The attack on Ethan had been staged to look like a riding accident. The riding instructor had tried to save Ethan, but fear kept him silent. Every person involved was arrested. Justice finally arrived. That same afternoon, reporters surrounded the hospital entrance. Hundreds of cameras waited. Victoria stepped to the microphone. The world expected another corporate speech. Instead, she pointed toward Elijah. "This man saved my son's life. But that's not today's story." She paused. "The real story is that we almost lost him because we judged the messenger instead of listening to the message." She turned toward the hospital board. "Effective immediately. I'm funding a new national program. No patient and no medical opinion will ever be ignored because of appearance, poverty, or status." The crowd applauded. Then she looked at Elijah. "I'd also like to announce the Dr. Elijah Brooks Pediatric Neurovascular Institute." The audience fell silent. Elijah looked stunned. "I don't need my name on a building." Victoria smiled through tears. "It isn't for you. It's for every young doctor who needs to learn what humility looks like." 6 months later, children filled the halls of the new institute. On the wall near the entrance hung a simple photograph. Not of a billionaire, not of a famous surgeon, but of an old black homeless man, standing beside a smiling little boy. Beneath it, a bronze plaque carried just one sentence: "Never judge the hands that can save a life by the clothes they wear."